friends, and welcome to the Harbor Breeze Home Podcast. I'm your host, Rita Joy, and today we're in part 3 of my husband's master's degree project on loneliness. If you want to hear the backstory of this mini-series, you might want to go back and listen to parts 1 and 2. As we grow older and enter new seasons of life, it seems there's always something new and different to adjust to. This morning, I was remembering back to the days of having young kids and newborn babies. As someone who has struggled with fatigue issues most of my life, those days were very, very hard for me physically. I remember just hanging on by a thread and dreaming about when I could grab just a few more minutes of sleep. Of course, I started asking older ladies for words of wisdom on this topic. More often than not, the response was, "Oh my goodness, if you think the newborn stage is hard, just you wait until." And then they'd insert some other stage in parenting that they thought was much harder. After about 3 conversations that went this way, I started to get very discouraged and seriously wondered if a person could actually die of exhaustion. But then Erwin and I had a pivotal conversation that changed everything. We decided that if we kept looking ahead in our parenting journey, dreading some next hard stage, we'd never look for the joys and delights of the stage we were currently living in. And we determined to expect that stages to come would be filled with all kinds of delightful things too. I think that mindset is what I want to take with me now as an empty nester grandma. I want to learn and prepare now with hope and excitement for the years ahead. Today's episode is about that, filled with practical ideas, touching stories, and even something you might find unexpected about a topic I love, laughter. So now I'll turn it over to Erwin. Thanks for being here, friend.
Welcome back to the Loneliness Project, a podcast dedicated to overcoming loneliness as we enter our later years. This is part 3, Building a Hope-Filled Life, Practical Ways to Stay Connected. I want to thank, once again, those of you who have responded in some way or other to encourage me in this project and to give me some feedback. I've heard from you via Instagram, email, and on my reflection questions form. I sent this out to my email list. If you'd like to see this and you're not on my list yet, you can contact me and I will send those to you. From hearing your stories, I realize that in so many ways we are just scratching the surface of this loneliness project. I feel we could spend several episodes on grief and loneliness alone, perhaps some other time. In the last episode, we talked about some of the issues around loneliness that are faced in later life, including medical assistance in dying, dementia, and end-of-life existential distress. Loneliness influences all 3. I was reminded recently that a part of dealing with dementia is that sometimes you forget about the socialization you've had. One dear lady I visited told me that her kids hadn't visited her for ages, and yet, in the same conversation, that her son had been to visit that morning. It's so hard. For this episode, I will focus on some ways to combat loneliness. I promise that this will be a much lighter episode than the last. Some of these ideas will seem obvious, while others may take you by surprise. Loneliness in older adults is not merely a result of physical isolation, but is deeply intertwined with their emotional and spiritual lives. Therefore, addressing loneliness is essential in building resilience. What I mean by that is that the physical, emotional, and spiritual are all a part of the cause and solution to loneliness. In this section, for the sake of explanation, I will focus more on the physical and emotional, but in reality, it is best to look at all 3 as a whole. I'll speak more about the spiritual and theological aspects in part 4. Let's start with physical activity and socialization. I think we all know that physical activity makes a difference in our physical health, but we are seeing that it makes a difference in our mental health as well, including our feelings of loneliness. Since everything we do is multi-layered, physical activity and socialization often happen at the same time. This was brought home to me on a recent bike ride. I mentioned in the first episode how I enjoyed riding alone. I'm alone with my thoughts, no phone or earbuds, just the trail, the bike, and nature. Today was different. Since there was a break in the weather, with more rainy weather on the way, everyone and their dog were out on the trails. I met grandparents with babies, parents with adult children, older people, younger people, big dogs, small dogs. There were people walking, jogging, biking, or e-biking. I even passed a group of people who had just gone for a swim in the icy ocean water. Brr. When I said good morning, beautiful day, or even just gave a smile, nearly everyone responded in kind. As I considered this loneliness project I've been working on, I realized that although I was on a solitary ride, I was part of a larger community. Sometimes our connections are deep, and we definitely need those. Other times, shallow connections are enough. I came home happy, even though my body was tired and sore from the ride. And when I say physical activity, it doesn't have to be a big ride or run or even walk. Any activity can have a positive effect. If there's fresh air involved, even better. If you can do this with a friend, that's awesome. But that's not always possible. I think that any effort we make in this area makes a difference. I chatted with an older single woman recently who expressed this idea in her own context. I cannot get around and volunteer like I used to, but as long as I can move around with my walker, I will go to the seniors group and church and go on cruises with my friends. I see people in the place where I live who are much worse off than I am, and so I try to be grateful. I knew another elderly woman who, although she was very, very limited in her mobility, kept her mind and fingers so busy knitting and crocheting for the care home staff and others that she told me she had no time to be lonely. It seems to be obvious, but sometimes the most obvious ideas are not obvious to everyone. Putting yourself out there socially makes a difference. The illustrations above are two examples, but I witness this in many other contexts as well. When a person puts themselves out and interacts with others in whatever way, they appear to be less lonely. This has nothing to do with mobility, but rather care for others and seeing the world as bigger than one's own troubles, as debilitating as they might be. Notice what the one woman I mentioned said. I try to be grateful. She was combining movement, socialization, and gratefulness. The alternative is not good. I truly believe that loneliness left untended will lead to more loneliness. One responder to my reflection questions told the story of her father, who was a very outgoing person. When his wife died, he was incredibly lonely. He ended up falling and was hospitalized and then onto a rehab facility. And in her words now, it was at the rehab place we saw a positive change in him. He was smiling again. He would joke with the staff and other patients. We realized it was a social interaction that led him out of the loneliness. When he got home, we hired a couple of young people to help him with everyday chores, and he enjoyed their company. I love this story and the fact that the family was proactive in providing people to be around their dad at home later. Encouraging socializing in those who are in the process of aging is good practice for those times when the aging process itself makes it more difficult to engage with others. One of you said in response to episode 1 that we need to risk becoming more socially interactive. It is a risk sometimes, but the reward is worth it. I feel like I need to say a word or two about being lonely while with a group of people. Sometimes it's with family or with a group of people who used to be your friends. This is hard. Even as adults, we can have times when we feel like the unpopular kid back in junior high school. For those of us with less of an outgoing personality, this can be difficult. So what do? If we pull back more, we will be even more socially isolated. I don't have a lot of good advice here since I sometimes fall into the same category, but I believe some of the answers I share from some of you, listeners, are helpful. In the reflection questions form that I sent to the email list, I asked what people were doing now to prevent loneliness later on. Here are a few of their responses. I build relationships into people's lives now, paying forward into others' lives of all ages. Someone else said, I make a daily effort to stay connected with those who are important to me in other places, such as sending notes in the mail and via email or text. If someone's on my mind, I make it a point of telling them so. I'm in the habit of sending an email to 4 other people each morning, stating 5 things for which I'm grateful. Someone else, learn how to be a good listener and ask good questions. Be curious about those around you, as I think people want to dialogue with others, and not just listen to your own monologue. Trying to stay involved and interested in the lives of others, in church and extended family. That last one was actually a good segue to the next idea I want to share. Socialization happens more easily when you belong to a group. One way to accomplish this is through church attendance. I read the following quote from Neil Krauss that shows the logical sequence of this idea. People who attend worship services more often tend to receive more informal spiritual support from fellow church members. Individuals who receive more spiritual support from fellow church members are more likely to be humble. Study participants who are humble report receiving more emotional support from their social network members. Receiving more emotional support is associated with feeling less lonely. And people who are less lonely tend to experience fewer physical health problems. Interesting. Now, I know that at some point, for some people, it becomes impossible to attend church on a regular basis. But the point remains that there is something about being with other people in a community as long as one can. Whether or not all the people you go to church with are perfect Christians is beside the point. Sometimes you want to go where everybody knows your name. I want to turn now to something that you may think I've lost my mind and gone off the deep end. Really? How could this make a difference in loneliness? I would imagine many of you have never heard of this before. Are you ready for it? Laughter yoga. Yeah, that's actually a thing. And if you can't get past the term yoga, let's just say laughter therapy. Here's basically what happens. Laughter yoga is essentially a session focused on laughing out loud together. It's led by a certified trainer who leads the group through exercises to laugh and clap in ways that seem artificial, except they work. Simulated laughter is based on the concept that a person can get the same physiological effect from self-induced laughter that they get from spontaneous laughter. I will put a couple of YouTube links in the show notes, and I bet you can't watch them without smiling. The one with the laughter guru actually cracks me up. Now I know what some of you may be thinking. Good grief, Erwin. This is a serious project for a seminary degree. How in the world does this affect loneliness? Well, let's stop and think about this for a minute. Have you noticed how adults tend to laugh less as they get older? This is a definite problem since it is known that laughter improves physical and psychological health-related outcomes across diseases and populations. I'm not making that up. That quote is from an article entitled Laughter Yoga, Adults with Parkinson's Disease and Caregivers, a pilot study. Another author stated, simulated laughter is based on the concept that a person can get the same physiological effect from self-induced laughter that they get from spontaneous laughter. I found 2 different journal articles on studies done in care homes in Turkey that prove that laughter has a positive effect on health with their residents. Without getting into all the technical details, they found that laughter therapy helped reduce the loneliness of the older adults involved. The studies would gather the residents together and have a laughter therapy session for an hour per week. The residents and staff reported less feelings of loneliness after every session. The writer of the book of Proverbs in the Bible said long ago that a cheerful heart is like a medicine, but a broken spirit saps a person's strength. Now, modern psychology is saying the same thing. The New Testament has several references to joy, but the one I want to remind us of is where we are encouraged to be joyful in hope. Laughter comes easier to those who have this kind of hope. Now, in part 2, I shared a story about my mother-in-law. I mentioned her laughter. I'm happy to report that her daughters have kept it up. When my wife gets together with her sisters, there's always laughter. Thankfully, not quite as loud. Those who have listened to Rita Joy on this podcast know that laughter is a value of hers. I love that. Today, as I bring this to a close, I want to tell a bit about my dad. Dad just had a birthday and turned 86. He's still full of life and energy. Dad was a pastor for many years. He still preaches often and travels around the Canadian prairies, getting people to sponsor children in poor countries. He makes it a point to make sure that every waitress he sees in Denny's has a good laugh before he finishes the meal. Sure, it is awkward for the rest of us sometimes, but I love the fact that a man who has seen a lot of life, who watched his wife of many years die of cancer, who is battling cancer himself along with a bad heart and only one good eye, can take the time to make sure that strangers around him have a good laugh or at least a smile. I'm convinced that humor is a part of what gives him and his new wife the ability to keep going at their age. So what will you do this week? How can you put some physical activity, socialization, and perhaps a laugh or two into your day? If you feel lonely, maybe get out for a walk. Say hi to your neighbor. Tell them a joke. See if you can get them to smile. Maybe you need to invite someone over and watch something that isn't serious. Watching the Marx Brothers or I Love Lucy might be just what the doctor ordered. Next week, I'll be discussing more resources for understanding loneliness that are found in the Bible. I also want to be able to discuss any questions that you may have had along the way. If you do have questions or comments, please send them to me early, as I do record earlier in the week before the podcast drops on Friday morning. Thank you for taking part of this project. This is Erwin, Mr. Harbor Breeze, signing off. Blessings, my friends.